Hello, everybody. My name's Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate for president in 2020, and this Green Socialist podcast is about keeping our program alive and talking about how to advance it after the election. And this week, issues we talked a lot about during the campaign about climate and social protections. They tried to get a vote on them in Congress when Biden met with a Democratic caucus and said, let's pass what he called or approve a framework for his Build Back Better reconciliation bill and pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And the progressives said, no, we're not doing that till we see the text. And the senators vote for it. And then the House Democrats will vote for the two bills together. So they're working as we speak, trying to get that all fixed and vote on it next week. That's the plan. But you look at what's in Build Back Better, and you have to realize that when Biden first proposed his American Jobs Plan, which dealt with climate and physical infrastructure, and then his American Families Plan, which dealt with the care economy, the total was over $6 trillion. And the progressives at that time, now we're talking back in March and April, said that's not enough. We need 10 trillion. And they even introduced a Thrive agenda as legislation from Senator Markey and some House progressives. And by the time we got to negotiating the budget blueprint over the summer, the ceiling became 3.5 trillion. So almost half of what Biden originally proposed and a third of what the progressives wanted. And the progressives accepted that. And then when they went to actually write the legislation, conservative Democrats said that's too much. And, Manchin saying his top number was 1.5 trillion. Senator Sinema was raising objections. There are a number of House Democratic conservatives, a little group of them around some different caucuses like the New Democratic Coalition and the Problem Solvers Caucus, were more with Manchin on the numbers and on the policy. So what we got now is 1.75 or 1.85, depending on which newspaper you read. Basically, what has happened throughout the whole year is that the progressives have made all the concessions, and Manchin and the conservatives have called all the shots. So there was a lot of happy talk in the spring about Biden being the new FDR, that the Democrats had become a kind of social democratic party instead of that old corporate neoliberal party that they've been for decades. But looking at the product now, you have to say it's the old corporate neoliberalism. I mean, even what's still in the bill is corporate welfare privatized or means tested depending on what programs you look at, like childcare, for example. The program they've got will be paid for by employer and employee fees or taxes. And it'll be for private insurance contracting with private providers. It's like our privatized healthcare system with some public money, basically propping it up. Instead of a public system that's universal, simple to administer, and without the enormous administrative overhead that this system, like our healthcare system, is going to create. So that's the old neoliberal thing, privatize the delivery of public services. Same thing with the Civilian Climate Corps, which the Sunrise Movement has been pushing. Give them credit. They got the amount increased. One of the few things that was increased from 10 billion to 30 billion over 10 years. The problem is, and they didn't really raise a criticism of this that I know of, at least not in public, the program is going to run through AmeriCorps, which does the Vistas and the Peace Corps. And it's an inefficient program because it takes the public money and then contracts with private nonprofits or for-profits that do the hiring of these, Vista volunteers. So that takes a lot more administrative overhead, a lot more paperwork, filling out grant forms, getting the requests for proposals. So it becomes a middle-class thing where these nonprofits absorb a lot of the money in nice salaries Whereas the people that these programs are designed to help, who tend to be low-income people, they don't see the money. They see the money spent on their behalf. And then some people come in and work with them. That's where the AmeriCare Corps or the Civilian Climate Corps is being set up. It's not like the old Civilian Conservation Corps under the New Deal, which was its own program. It designed the projects in consultation with local government and hired the workers. And so this is privatized as well. And then the child tax credit, which is only extended for a year, is more means tested than before. And already what we had this year, 14% of poor children didn't even get it because their parents didn't submit income tax returns. And if they were going to get the credit, they had to navigate a web page that was not that simple. A lot of people don't have access to the internet. They don't have it at home. They don't have a laptop they can take to the McDonald's parking lot. So a lot of people that were nominally qualified didn't get it. Now they set up a lot more barriers, more paperwork to document that, and there are like 7 or 8 categories you have to meet to be able to prove that you're deserving of the child tax credit. Of course, that's the parent or custodian, not the child who it's supposed to help, who's just, a victim of this bureaucracy. So that's the old corporate neoliberalism. And then you got to look what was left out. I mean, it's astounding to me. There's such popular programs, like something like 80% of public opinion polling says they want Medicare to negotiate lower prices for prescription drugs with Big Pharma. And that's out. Now, one of the guys that torpedoed that, Scott Peters, a Democrat from California who got a lot of Big Pharma money to torpedo Medicare negotiating prices, is coming out with a much watered down version that would deal only with post-patent drugs. So after the patent runs out and they've, maximized their profit while it's still protected intellectual property, then you can negotiate some prices. And it's, I don't know if that's going to go through, but that's what he is working on. Maybe it just covers a little bottom, because I think voters in his district are probably mad at him. But he got a lot of Big Pharma money, as did the other Democrats, like Senator Sinema, who objected to this. Paid family and medical leave is out. I mean, if you look on a map, and the only countries beside the U.S. that don't have paid family and medical leave are Suriname in South America and Papua New Guinea in north of Australia, and then a couple of tiny Pacific islands where those people, live off their gardens and their fishing. They don't have a cash economy that paid family leave would be relevant to. So, I mean, we are just so backward in that respect. Very poor countries all over the world provide some family and medical leave for employees, and we don't. And it's not in this Build Back Better bill. And then you go to climate, the most strongest piece of what was left, and we've had a lot of criticisms of their climate approach, but there was a clean energy standard. They called it a Clean Energy Performance Program, where they would pay utilities to increase their renewables, and they get the payment if they increase it by 4% or more a year. And it also said if you don't increase it by 4% or more a year, you're going to be penalized with fines. So it was a carrot and a stick. They got rid of all the carrots. So now all there is hundreds of billions of dollars over the next decade in tax incentives and subsidies and loans, low interest loans, to go renewable. But all I think that's going to do is repeat the pattern we've seen for the last decade. We have had an increase in renewables, particularly as the price is going down, but it's only really expanded our total energy. It has not replaced the fossil fuels. And what we found from a UN production gap study came out recently is that the US plans to increase its oil production 17% and its gas production 12% by 2030. That's mostly fracked oil and fracked gas. And around the world, the planned oil, gas, and coal production is 120% over what a carbon budget to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold or goal that the Paris Climate Agreement set. It's sort of the safety boundary for the climate. So, I mean, like I said, and this is corporate neoliberalism, subsidized corporations. And you got to realize the solar market is dominated by ExxonMobil, Chevron, and BP. And the wind market is dominated by GE and Siemens and Vestas. And I'm talking like 80% of market share. So these are subsidies to, big business, not, people think of little solar installers and whatnot. They're not going to get the money. It's going to go to these big energy and industrial or manufacturing corporations, which in our eco-socialist Green New Deal, we want to take over and run as public utilities and make them do the right thing, phase out their fossil fuels and phase in the renewables. Free community college, very popular, left out. Expanding Medicare coverage to age 60 and vision and dental benefits. Now, one of the ironies here is that one of the progressives, Pramila Jayapal, who has been leading, kind of speaking for the progressives as they take concession after concession, and said when Biden came out with his framework that they passed a resolution, the Progressive Caucus, saying we enthusiastically support it. They rightly said we're not going to vote for it for the bipartisan infrastructure bill until we see the text and it's on the agenda, the Build Back Better reconciliation bill. That was understandable, but they have basically given their blessings to this way scaled down neoliberal kind of approach to these issues. So now Jayapal, when she put in the House version of single payer, again, more room for privatization, private insurance administration of Medicare benefits. But then at her news conference, when she released it, it was Medicare for all, but she basically said, I'm with Bernie, Medicare for 60 and up, which was what Bernie Sanders was pushing. He has not put his single payer Medicare for all bill in the Senate this session. So the progressives have been retreating on Medicare for all every step of the way. And it's off the agenda now as far as they're concerned. And then when it came to paying for this thing, I mean, the main proposal was to increase corporate and personal income tax brackets, basically back to where they were before Trump's tax cuts for the rich. And, Manchin and Sinema and those conservative House Democrats objected to that. So now they got a range of small things like more enforcement so that the rich evade taxes less. Trying to remember, there's like 8 or 9 of them. A 15% corporate minimum income tax. It's kind of a grab bag, and it's not clear to me without looking more deeply, but I'm skeptical that it's going to raise what they say. Now, it actually says it's going to raise $2 trillion or 1,995 billion, which is more than they plan to spend. So I don't know. This is, again, austerity. They're going to raise more money than they're going to spend under this bill. And so, yeah, I've been saying the progressives made the concessions, the conservative Democrats called the shots, and Biden allied with the conservatives because the progressives said, he's the final arbiter, and they've been so, they've been praising Biden to the, all the time. And on the one hand, it's understandable. The Democrats have narrow majorities, so their conservatives can assert their power. But there was another path that could have been taken that maybe a Bernie Sanders would have took, but Biden didn't, and that is to go to the public, go on the media, go out to the states and say, here's what is in the bill, like negotiating drug prices, Medicare on behalf of all the people with the drug companies. And the other programs that are in it or were cut. And because all people have heard is, how much it's going to cost without knowing what's in it, and build support and build pressure on the Manchins and the Sinemas and the conservative House Democrats. Instead, Biden pandered to the conservatives, and, the Progressive Caucus has gone along for the ride. They really only leverage they had was to keep the two bills linked because they did get that promise at one point. So we'll see what happens next week. But, I think the bottom line is we still need a real Green New Deal like we were talking about. A plan with public ownership of the energy, transportation, and key manufacturing sectors to get to 100% clean energy in a decade, and then begin reducing carbon emissions with ecosystem, forest reforestation and other ways of drawing carbon back out of the atmosphere and back into the biosphere or the geosphere. And then we need an economic bill of rights that guarantees people and gives them a legal right to sue if the government doesn't provide things like a living wage job, an income over poverty, affordable housing, quality health care, lifelong public education, and a secure retirement. So whatever happens, whenever they vote on this stuff, we still have a lot more to push for. So this all precedes Glasgow, where they're having COP26, the Council of the Parties, in other words, the states. And I don't think we can expect much from that. Key players are missing, like the Pentagon and Putin and Xi from China. U.S. military is the world's largest single carbon emitter, and they put out recently, along with the intelligence communities, reports that said, the climate crisis is the biggest security threat we face, and there are no Department of Defense officials in Biden's delegation. And in Putin, I don't know what his excuse is. He runs a weak economy. It's about the size of New York State, but it's a petro state dependent on selling gas and oil. So he really doesn't want to make commitments. And until recently, I think for public relations reasons, he was as much of a climate denier as Trump. And then you got President Xi in China, where they just having energy shortages. They just said they're going to build, I think it was 43 more coal plants, and they build them fast. And they don't plan to get to zero, or what they call net zero emissions, till 2060. And they, of course, are the world's largest emitter now. So right off the bat, you go into there and you're missing some key players. And as I mentioned, the UN came out with a production gap study, which showed that the world plans to extract more coal, oil, and gas, 120% more than we should if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So people are calling, the Glasgow Summit the last chance. I heard that about Copenhagen in 2009 and Paris in 2015, and they had more on their agenda in terms of what was expected. The expectations here are low. I just hope people don't get discouraged when not a whole lot comes out of this summit. And we'll have to see what it is, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be a lot less than what we need. We really need a global Green New Deal. The U.S., as the world's, which has emitted 25% of historical emissions, and that doesn't even count our emissions abroad, which we are still, is still a big portion of the emissions we should account for, because usually or often in U.S.-based corporations that own mines and factories and agribusiness farms and plantations, they're emitting a lot of carbon by burning fossil fuels to produce goods that we import and use. And a lot of times people think, well, they're mostly in the global south exporting to the rich north. And they do export a lot. But most of that carbon emissions from their production is for their domestic markets, particularly China. It's 85% in China. So we've got to work with those countries. That's why we need a global Green New Deal. The U.S. owes a climate debt, but rather than looking at it as, some obligation we got to pay off, we should see it as an investment in the habitability of the planet for Americans as well as everybody else in the world. So that's what ought to be on the agenda, but there is nothing in Build Back Better for international climate financing, for building clean power systems across the world, or for reforesting all the areas in the tropical areas, the temperate areas, the boreal, northern areas, which would draw a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. and for the mitigation of the climate damage going on right now from, fires and droughts and floods and heat that has become so hot in some of the tropical countries that it's unlivable and people are moving. So we got a climate refugee problem. All that needs to be paid for. And the U.S. ought to be in the lead as the world's richest country. And as I said, it's an investment in our future as well as everybody else's. So the eco-socialist Green New Deal on a global scale is what we got to keep working for. So I'm gonna wrap up here and start taking questions. I just want to remind everybody, the election's on Tuesday. In most states, it's just going to be local folks, if at all. But where you do have those elections, they're important. Ranked choice voting is on the ballot in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in Broomfield, Colorado, and Westbrook, Maine. And in Kansas City, Missouri, they're coming up on the deadline for a petition to get it on there, to get ranked choice voting on their ballot in the future. And that petition's due November 15th. I think they need 7,500. So if you're around there, they could use your help. And as you go down ballot, don't think those races aren't important. In particular, even where they're not Greens in the race, you got to vote against the fascists, particularly in these county and town election administrator roles, because the Republican neo-fascists are targeting those. And, they are there to basically subvert the elections, overturn them or mess around with the count. We just found out about another QAnon Republican. In which state was this? They got one in Colorado before. I think this was Michigan, where they took the scanners that count the paper ballots, and she just stole them because she said they were fixed, even though they elected her last year and Trump won that town. So, but QAnon people are not known for that, being the sharpest knives in the drawer. But anyway, there's a real push to get their people in place so they can steal elections. So go down your ballot, study the ballot, and use your vote. It's your voice. It's not the only thing we need to do, but it's something we got to do when we have the opportunity. So I'm going to stop there and looking forward to your questions and comments. Eric Gray, given the need for a global Green New Deal, what would be the most effective ways to fight for local Green New Deals? Well, I think, first of all, come up with a plan, work with all the people that are interested in the different aspects of it, from housing to energy production to transportation, and then figure out what you can do with what, your local budgets can support, and make that part of your Green New Deal, and then finish it out to get to 100% clean energy and so forth, and then say, here's what it costs, and then you make that demand to your state government and the federal government. So there's a lot you can do. I think would really help is if we insist that the planning board or commission or whatever it's called in your city or town, they become the real planners. We elect those people, or they're appointed by people we do elect. Because the typical situation now is developers come to them with plans, which they generally rubber stamp because developers in the real estate industry tend to finance and run local politics. We got to turn that relationship around. Have public planning for the things we want, public transportation, affordable housing, clean energy production, and then tell the developers, here's what we want, put out a request for proposals, let them bid on building it, instead of just rubber stamping what they want to build. Because what they want to build is energy and efficient and, urban sprawl and all that stuff and gentrification and displacement of lower income people. So I think, that ought to be the core of a Green New Deal in a city or town, getting control of the planning process, and then getting control of your power utility, municipalize if you don't already have a municipal public power system. And then you got the power to say, we're going to build renewable generation. And with our revenue stream and our assets, we can finance the retrofitting of all the buildings in the jurisdiction covered, where you put the money up front and then the ratepayers pay it back over time. and it's going to save them money in the end because renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. Because once you build the solar and wind and ground source or air source heat pumps infrastructure, you don't need to buy fuel because the wind blows, the sun shines, and that powers the grid, which will power your heat pumps. So that's how you get our building stock to get on clean renewables. There's a lot we can do locally, and we need to and show and set an example for these fools that are running the government down in Washington, as we can see from this Build Back Better BS. Cat paradise or paradise. So what is going to happen with Assange's extradition? Who approved it? It says the U.S. has. Yeah, the U.S. is asking for his extradition. It was the Trump administration that brought the charges against Assange, which is ironic because Trump was talking about how much he loved WikiLeaks when he was running for president, because at the time they were leaking stuff out of the Clinton campaign that wasn't flattering, to say the least. And but then, they kept going. And Vault 7, which was a lot of the CIA's tools for, getting into our computers, even our electronics on our cars, really ticked off the CIA. So Trump indicted Assange on, 17 counts under the Espionage Act, which is a law that was passed during World War I, probably should be repealed as unconstitutional. One thing under that law is you cannot defend whatever you did they're objecting to by saying it was in the public interest. Like you provided information the public ought to know. That's why Edward Snowden is exiled in Russia. That wasn't the country he chose, but the U.S. kind of forced him there when they wouldn't let his next flight go to Ecuador, or Cuba, then Ecuador, I think was the flight path. So he's stuck in Russia. And he told us that the National Security Agency was spying on all our phone calls. And, he revealed that. Now, if he could come, and that's why he's in exile, because he says, I can't use doing that as a public interest offense under the Espionage Act. So that's what they're charging Assange with. He was a publisher and a journalist. If he is convicted, you might as well convict the New York Times and the Washington Post and shut them down. Because all the news about Washington, almost all of it comes from leaks, whether they're documents or just statements by anonymous sources who are anonymous because they don't want to get in trouble for speaking publicly. So, so they charged Assange, and then the UK held him in violation of a parole agreement or some kind of agreement because he took refuge in an Ecuadorian embassy when he was supposed to show up for charges from Sweden, and which has since been dropped. So Kat is asking, so now the appeal was approved by whom? By the Biden administration. They're in charge of this prosecution now. And, we should demand that they drop it because it's a prosecution of the First Amendment. And Assange is a convenient vehicle. Well, they don't like Assange, but if he gets convicted, it's a execution of the First Amendment. Puts all of our First Amendment rights in jeopardy. So now the last 2 days or 3 days now, last 2 days, they've had hearings about his extradition to the U.S. And, you can read on what's been said there. But one of the things in the background, which may have influence, is that under Trump, the CIA, although Trump didn't approve it, it was done by who was heading the CIA then, who became one of those Trump guys. I can't remember the name right now. They were thinking, they started exploring how they might assassinate or kidnap and assassinate Assange. And so they went through the planning. That came out in a report from Yahoo News, Michael Isikoff and colleagues, which the lawyers for Assange says how can he expect to get a fair trial? And if he convicted, safe conditions of incarceration when the government was thinking about assassinating him. And that's why they appealed the extradition, because the first judge said she didn't think that he could be safely held in U.S. prisons because the conditions are so harsh. So that's where that case is at right now. I think people ought to be writing the Biden administration saying, drop the charges on Assange, let him go free, and let him be what he was, a publisher. And let this war on whistleblowers goes back, especially to the Obama administration. That Espionage Act was not used but a couple of times from. They used it during World War I. They were after people like Eugene Debs and A. Philip Randolph and Emma Goldman, and then they didn't use it. There was one definite case of what do you call it, spying and espionage, and then there was Daniel Ellsberg, but they couldn't pursue that because Ellsberg's rights were violated because they invaded and burglarized his psychiatrist's office to get background on Ellsberg and other violations of his civil rights and civil liberties. So the judge threw out the case because of government misconduct. Now, what the lawyers are arguing is that the CIA planning how to kidnap and maybe assassinate Assange is government misconduct, and he should be freed. So we'll see what happens. Russell Fedorka, what do you think of the lithium battery waste problem when they're spent? Also, have you heard of progress with chlorine and hydrogen fuels feasibility? Yeah, lithium waste is a problem. Lithium resources are a problem. And to mine or extract lithium, the concentrated lithium is in 3 South American countries, Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina. And they're mining for it down there. And that creates huge waste problems right at the mine. And then when a battery is used up, we've got to have a circular economy with zero waste so that the lithium that is put into the waste stream when a battery is used up gets recycled and reused. So that's what we've got to develop. Now, that's going to raise the cost. There are other ways of other things we can use for batteries, like what do we use? Nickel before lithium. That's not such a rare earth. So we need research on those things. Even the strands of industrial hemp plants are good conductors for the kind of thing that batteries do. You can look that up online. We've seen that. So we got to make the batteries more environmentally friendly, and then not let the lithium and other products of the batteries go into the waste stream and landfills. They got to be recycled. Progress on chlorine and hydrogen fuels. I know a little bit about chlorine with respect to airline fuel. I don't know much about it. Hydrogen fuels, again, what they do is strip the hydrogen, preferably out of water, because then the byproduct is oxygen. But it's mostly now taken from natural gas, where the byproduct is carbon, and that gets in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And that's a big problem. But what you're doing is hydrogen is not an energy source. It stores energy. And then you can put it in a fuel cell. And when the hydrogen recombines with the oxygen, you get water vapor. That's the only emission. And, that's not a problem. But because it's expensive to extract the hydrogen, and then when you burn it in a fuel cell, you lose some efficiency there. So you're better off doing solar and wind for most cases, but hydrogen has a role in industrial processes like steel making, cement making, and other processes where you need high heat. Hydrogen can replace fossil fuels. And then that's probably the principal place. There's also storage, so it can help, provide base load when wind and sun are not available for energy. So hydrogen will play a role, but it's a minor role. And the thing we got to watch out for, there are subsidies in this Build Back Better bill for hydrogen, but they're talking about gray hydrogen, which is just stripping it off of carbon, blue hydrogen, which is just stripping the hydrogen off of methane and then storing the carbon capture and sequestration, which is not proving economical. I mean, there are a lot of projects around the world. It's very expensive, or it doesn't work in a lot of the plants they built. And then there's green hydrogen, which uses electrolysis to separate the oxygen and the hydrogen. That's a clean fuel, and that's what should be subsidized. But the Build Back Better subsidies do not require that they go to green hydrogen. So that's a problem. Have you seen the Lucra Denouncer? Have you seen the CNN segment on Stephen Donziger? Are you surprised that they even covered that story? I did see it on Jake Tapper yesterday afternoon, and I was surprised they covered it. It was pretty much a straight up news story. And, Jake Tapper, who is not shy about making editorial comments, said nothing. I think it was a taped segment. The reporter presented, maybe it was live, but anyway, he made no comment on it. He just moved on to the next story. But I was surprised and pleased that they gave that some coverage. The problem is just that one segment. And if you don't hear that in TV, you got to hear it over and over before it sinks in, as opposed to print where you can go back and you can stop and think about it. So, but the fact that they covered it at all is the first thing about Stephen Donziger I've seen in the major TV network. So I was glad to see it. At war with dust. What do you make of the attempts to tie resurgent labor strikes to the resistance to vaccine mandates? Alex Gutentag at Tablet Magazine does this. And even Richard Wolff suggesting doing so in a recent tweet. Jesus. Well, first of all, yeah, there's some strikes, but historically and in my lifetime, this is nothing compared to what we've had before. The organized labor is about 11.7%, that's the last figure I saw, of the whole workforce. And in the private sector, it was 5.9% the last I looked. You're not going to have a strike wave, a real strike wave, with hundreds of thousands of people participating, like we did after World War II, like we did in the 1930s, like we did in the early 70s, without getting a lot more of those people organized. Because if you don't have a union to back up your strike, and you're just a bunch of people that went out on strike, you have no resources to back you up, no way to defend yourself against scabs. So I know people are excited about some of these strikes, but we got to put things in perspective. And what does that have to do with vaccine mandates? I don't know. Are the cops and firefighters in New York who are right now resisting the mandates, are they going out on strike? I haven't heard that. They stayed home. I think there was sick out yesterday, the New York City Fire Department. I mean, these are people that, for the most part, it's sort of the family business. They all live on Staten Island or Long Island. And they have a very antagonistic relationship to the working class people of color majority in New York City. So to call that a labor strike, these people are defending basically white privilege and their own privileges in one of the best public sector jobs that there is. And linking that with the vaccine mandate resistance, which is financed by the oligarchs that are financing the Trump movement, the Koch brothers, and people like that, the what are they called? The people in Long Island, the hedge fund people, the Mercers, and people like that. There's been, a lot of research. You can find articles where they have been fomenting this resistance to mandates. They use libertarian messaging, even though their goal is illiberal authoritarian capitalism. So, and I don't know what I didn't see Richard Wolff's tweet, but the people striking at Deere, maybe the UAW is going on strike. What are some of the other strikes? Starbucks out in Seattle, I think, or one of the four cities, one of the cities, the Seattle Starbucks baristas are going out on strike. This is not about the vaccine mandate. The only one I can think of are these dumb cops and firefighters who are public servants interacting with the public, and they don't want to get a damn vaccine. I mean, come on. So I just think, don't get these two mixed up. Scout Trooper 164. Howie, have you heard about New York City shutting down certain areas that recycle fossil fuels? I know that we just got stopped a gas-fired power plant, frack gas, in North Brooklyn. Recycle fossil fuels, I'm not sure what that refers to. Is that like oil coming out of auto shops that they pull it together and then have it, processed so it can be used again? I mean, when you burn gas or oil or coal, it's burned up. So maybe that's recycling, motor oil and things like that. And I do know where they collect their leaks and their problems, and people around those facilities have complaints. But I haven't heard about them shutting down. But if there are places where people get sick from the leaks and the fumes, maybe they should be shut down. Scout Trooper 164. What are your thoughts on the Biden administration backing the release of the JFK assassination files? Well, they held them up, actually. They were supposed to be released, and they're saying because of the pandemic backup, the National Archives didn't get finished redacting stuff that's still of national security concern. So the Biden administration says, oh, you said blocking. I misread that. Yeah, they blocked them. So, this stuff is 60 years old now. I don't know what current national security interests would be threatened. The only thing I can think is, the reputation and pride of some people that were involved. That's the only logical explanation for what they got to hide. So, I'd like all the files to be out so people that dig into that stuff can, go through it and continue to argue. I mean, there's no consensus on who killed JFK. There are all kinds of theories that it was more than J. Harvey Oswald, and some people believe he did it by himself. They even told us that in the Marine Corps. They called him an ex-Marine, not a former Marine like those of us that are retired, but pulling off the shots he did, only a Marine could do, is what the point was in boot camp. It's kind of the crazy way to talk about things in boot camp. But anyway, some people believe J. Harvey Oswald pulled off those very difficult shots with the weapon he had, which he could barely, reload or get ready to fire again in the time frame that those rounds went off. So anyway, I'd like to see all the information out, and I don't know what they're hiding. Michael Shin, any tips on where to easily find laws and regulations on political campaigning, especially the legality of canvassing on college campus, in college dorms, within gated apartment communities, etc.? Yeah, there's a whole there's a lot of case law about that, I know. And each state will have its own laws, and municipalities might have laws. So first you got to find out that. Then you got to find what case law has said are your rights. And the person I would call, or the organization I would call, to get a feel on that case law is the Center for Competitive Democracy out of DC. They have a couple lawyers on staff. Their specialty is ballot access, but election law generally, they're very involved in. And, ballot access, to get petitions signed, you got to get to the people. So it's not just canvassing for signatures rather than, votes on college campuses and so forth. Is relevant to the issue of ballot access. So Center for Competitive Democracy is where I would start if I was researching this question. And I do recall that there was a case that the neo-fascist LaRouche organization brought against Princeton when they threw their people off Princeton. And as I recall, the court decision said Princeton gets a lot of public money, therefore it's covered by the First Amendment. So Princeton can regulate the hours and so forth, and means by which people can be on campus with their political stuff, but they can't bar them from the campus. So that's what I'm thinking of when I say case law. So that's the best I can tell you. I'm not a lawyer and certainly not a specialty in this field, but that's what I know about that question. Solid Arnos 2222. Have the New York Greens taken a position on Democratic Socialist Buffalo mayoral candidate India Walton? What is the legacy of DSA and the Working Families Party in New York State that are major supporters of Walton? The Greens have not taken a formal position on Walton. I think most of us are rooting for her. I mean, Byron Brown is, I gotta say, he's just a pig. He's been in bed with the real estate people, and when that old man was knocked down by the cops and split his head open on the ground, Byron Brown, and he was no offense. He wasn't, assaulting the officers. They just shoved him and he went down. He was like 75, 76 years old. And Byron Brown backed the cops on that. And the cops, when, people raised a stink, they had like a walkout about it because they supported the assault on this citizen. So, whatever you think, India Walton, she's got to be better than Byron Brown. At least that's my personal opinion. The legacy of DSA and Working Families Party in New York State. Well, they have been supporting Democrats. Working Families Party, they support them right up to Cuomo. Every time I ran for governor, they supported Cuomo. The third time Cuomo ran, they supported Cynthia Nixon in a primary, but then backed Cuomo right away. DSA has avoided us in the statewide races because they say we're too small to handle statewide. We just deal with local races. But then they haven't helped some of our candidates at the local level. But it depends on the DSA local. My presidential campaign got 3 DSA locals around the country to endorse the campaign. DSA in Pittsburgh is providing a lot of support to Connor Mulvaney, who's running for city council as a Green, right up to doing the phone banking. So, I haven't had a good relationship with DSA and especially the Working Families Party. They've canvassed against me in this county when they had a lot of Working Families Democrats running against Republicans, and then they had this Working Families Democrat running against the Green. And this Working Families Democrat, pretty conservative guy. He had more developers and real estate and landlords behind him than the mayor did. And they came in here and swamped this district. It's the 4th district of Syracuse with canvassers the last 10 days of a campaign. I lost that election by 96 votes. And the Working Families Upstate Regional Director said at the time, said on Facebook at 2 a.m, I'm working out at UPS sweating like a dog. I guess he had a few beers because he said on there he'd rather see a Tea Party Republican elected than Howie Hawkins of the Green Party. And that's why they were supporting this Democrat against me and ignoring all the Democrats they had endorsed against Republicans. So I have some problems with Working Families in New York State. On the other hand, the door is always open if they change their mind. Like working for fair ballot access, proportional representation, ranked choice voting of executive offices statewide and for president. In fact, the Greens, I hope, in New York State will be putting that to them in this election next year in 2022. So I'll be very curious to see what happens with India Walton. The polls are not good. I mean, the last poll I saw, she was behind 17 points. The Republicans have united with the corporate Democrats to stop this young woman who, she's really from the community and has the, good progressive positions on the issues before the city. So we'll see what happens there. That's next Tuesday. Although given that there's so many write-in votes, they may not have the results until mid-November, if it's at all close. Beth Graham, Howie, what news sources do you regularly follow? How about journalists? Who is worth paying attention to? Well, I read New York Times, Washington Post, The Intercept. Those are probably my, sort of straight news sources that I check every day in terms of, news magazines and commentary, Counterpunch, The Nation, The New Republic, Democracy Now! That's sort of more newsy, I guess. So that's pretty much what I cover every day. Journalists, I'd say I think the best journalist in the country is Anand Gopal, who's right now in Afghanistan, as far as I know, embedded with rural people who supported the Taliban, finding out what's going on. He wrote the best book on Afghanistan back in 2014. He's done the same thing in Syria. It's risky, but man, his reports, you can find him in the New Yorker. He was interviewed on Democracy Now! Recently about what's going on in Afghanistan. So I could list some journalists, but I don't know if that makes any sense. I mean, I'm trying to think who when I see their byline, I always read. And in the Washington Post and New York Times, I don't really do that. I mean, they're journalists I know personally, like Jesse McKinley at the New York Times or Jimmy Vilkind at the Wall Street Journal, that I read just because I know them. So, I think you got to read the news to get the straight news. And I think despite the terrible things the Washington Post, New York Times have done, particularly when it comes to wars abroad, or like holding on to the information that we were torturing for a year, the New York Times did that. What they do report, I think, is generally accurate, although you always got to look at it critically and then look for independent news sources, particularly, firsthand reports where the person, and this you can do more in broadcast media, are speaking for themselves and what their background is. But it's anyway, that's who I follow. Abigail, would Greens push for a strong agrarian movement or smart city approach to pollution, plastics, climate change? Well, strong agrarian movement in terms of supporting a transformation of agriculture to regenerative organic methods that rebuild soil and stops using pesticides and chemical fertilizers, all are good for the environment and the ecosystems in which these farms are located in many ways. A smart city approach to pollution, plastics, climate change. Well, smart city approach to pollution. That's good if it's done the right way. Like moves traffic more quickly so that there's less idling and pollution from that. On the other hand, smart city can mean surveillance. And face recognition. So an authoritarian state or city can follow you around, and they want to get you have a better means of getting you, set up in some kind of problem. So you got to watch the smart city innovations to make sure they're advancing the stated objective and not just about spying on us. And plastics and climate change, yeah, that's a big issue, because one of the ways the fossil fuel industry wants to continue extracting and using fossil fuels is by increasing plastics production. For example, they want to build a big plastics complex in the Ohio Valley on both the West Virginia and Ohio sides, where all this frack gas from Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia can be used to make plastics. And then in Cancer Alley, this region along the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, where there's all kinds of chemical factories and oil refineries. And they call it Cancer Alley because the people have extraordinarily high rates of cancer from what the fumes are breathing. They have a proposal to build the biggest plastics complex in the world. That's still going through the regulatory process, and the people there are fighting it. And right now, it's kind of on a temporary hold, from what I understand. But the company, I don't think, has gave up. So we got to move off of plastics. There are other ways to package products using plant-based materials. And then, we used to have milk bottles. So, glass can be used in certain circumstances. But plastics, they are not biodegradable. They accumulate in the ecosystems either as just trash, or some of their chemicals are bioactive. We absorb them and they interact with our endocrine system and screw up our hormones. They are now ubiquitous. It's in all of us. It's in the fish, because a lot of that plastic ends up in the ocean, and we have those big piles of plastic. So we gotta reduce plastics. Basically, zero out synthetic plastics for sure. And even the biodegradable plastics are problematic in some respects. So there are other materials you can look up online. There's, well over a dozen ideas. I see hemp in the, hemp paper is, really strong, and hemp cloth. So that's, those materials can be used for packaging products. And that relates to climate change, because burning fossil fuels to produce the plastics and extracting fossil fuels for the plastics, as well as for burning and other uses, contributes to climate change. Sensi, Howie Hawkins, what's your opinion on the white supremacists protesting outside Philadelphia? And is Penske banning them from renting trucks? Penske banning them from renting trucks effective? So I guess Penske's one of those outfits like you all. So I don't know what the white supremacists outside Philly are doing, but if Penske decided they didn't want to rent to them, is it effective? That depends if all the companies that rent that what the trucks they wanted refuse. So then it would be effective, I assume, obstructing what they wanted to do with the trucks. But I haven't heard about the protests outside Philadelphia, so I don't have a lot to say. Kenda Hanuman, what is your thought about utility scale solar farms? I think it's part of the answer. We need a lot of rooftop with net metering. So we're using less land. The roofs are already there. But we also need utility scale to have enough power. And it's very economically efficient. So it makes the cost of energy less. So the problem is siting them. And that's where you got to bring local communities in. I think the best way to get them going is rather than have the state say to a community, we're bringing this in, the state should say, we got this money to help communities that want to have utility scale solar farms. And then have the communities come. Because a lot of them are looking for ways to develop their local economies, and the income from a utility scale solar farm might fit their needs. And then they got to get the local people behind it. But you have one of those, it distributes the tax base more, and it produces electricity that will go, particularly if you have a municipal power system, a public power system, to the coffers of the community rather than stockholders outside the community. Oh, it's 4 o'clock already. But I'm gonna answer one more question. I see it's from Carl Lundgren. Hi, Carl. I know you down in the Bronx. So, hey, Howie, are we Greens going to take Build Back Better from the Dems and turn it into something green as the Dems took the Green New Deal from us and butchered it? I think because the Dems butchered it and discarded the Green New Deal, we really have ownership of that. And the progressive Democrats need to follow our lead because AOC and Markey watered it down. They left out the stopping, fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure, the phase out of nuclear power, the cuts to the military budget to fund the Green New Deal. And then they extended the deadline to get to zero emissions from 2030 to 2050, which is too slow a schedule. So I think Green New Deal is a great slogan. It's, under debate. I think that's the Greens' contribution to this whole thing. And it goes way beyond where the Dems want to go. Biden explicitly rejected it in the 2020 campaign, as did Harris. And so, and then, Pelosi never let him vote on the non-binding resolution for a Green New Deal. Neither did Schumer once he got control of the Senate. So it's ours, not theirs. And that's what we really need, not this Build Back Better, blah, 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 as Greta Thunberg put it. So we're done. So what can I say to wrap up? I guess I'll go back to the election and urge people to go out there. And even those local elections are more important than you think, particularly when it comes to election administration, with the Republicans trying to set it up to steal elections. We have, Greens running for local office, in a few cases, statewide office. Well, in one case, that's New Jersey, where we have Madeline Hoffman running for governor, and a running mate for lieutenant governor, whose name I'm blanking on, I'm sorry. And but there are tickets, so they're easy to find on the ballot there in New Jersey. There are local candidates in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, California. I mean, many places. So, be sure to get out there and vote. And then next week will be interesting. If Pramila Jayapal is right, they're going to vote on Build Back Better, and they're going to call defeat victory. And we have to say, there's some good things in there, like the universal pre-K. That's the one thing they didn't mess up with privatization or means testing and stuff like that. But we got to go a lot further to provide people with economic security and to protect the climate, because my fear is that these incentives will lead to building more solar and wind where they can make nice profits, but not phasing out the legacy solar, gas, and the legacy coal plants. They're starting to phase them out for gas, but they're building more gas-fired plants. One victory we had this week is we got 2 canceled. They're really upgrades of existing plants. One in Astoria, Queens, and the other in the Hudson Valley. So, that's something positive happened this week. We sometimes get discouraged when we watch what goes on in Washington, but we won a couple of victories in New York. Now we got many more to win in terms of fossil fuel infrastructure. The fight over Line 3 in northern Minnesota and Line 5 in northern Michigan continue. And, particularly Line 3 saw a lot of struggle this summer, hundreds of people arrested. And the company has opened it up. It's bringing tar sands oil, the dirtiest oil you can think of, through those pipelines onto refineries. So that fight goes on. There's a lot of fights on infrastructure going on, and we can win those even if right now we haven't got the kind of massive investment in the global Green New Deal. And I guess the last point I'll make is that there's nothing in Build Back Better for international climate change. Biden has made some promises to put a few billion into the, what's it called, the Green Investment Fund that's supposed to help the Global South build renewable energy. That's a drop in the bucket as to what's needed. And, you know, out of these COP summits going back to, I guess it was 2011 in Cancun, they promised to build it up to 100 billion a year. And they've only got, last time I looked was last summer, it barely over 10 billion total, not per year. And Biden has upped that a little bit in his speeches, but I haven't seen it in Build Back Better. Now, there are hundreds of programs in there. Maybe I missed it, but it's certainly not getting highlighted in the media coverage. And we've got to look at that. I mean, the third world, the global South, now produces about 2/3 of the world's carbon emissions. China, India, obviously big in that, but you know, other countries like Indonesia and the Philippines and Thailand and Vietnam, where a lot of manufacturing is done. Some of those countries, mining is done. Argentina is another one. Brazil, South Africa. They produce 2/3 of the world's carbon now. So it's not just a matter of, as historically the U.S. has emitted the most carbon and imposed climate change on the rest of the world. Now we've outsourced production to the global South, where labor is cheap and environmental regulations are often lax. And then we import those goods back. So you can call that emissions abroad, but a lot of that production is for domestic markets. We think of China as, you know, exporting everything, but no, they only export about 15% of what they produce. 85% is for their massive domestic market. Same kind of proportions in India. So we have an interest, as does everybody on Earth, in getting those countries to go to 100% clean energy. So we need a global Green New Deal. And we had $1 trillion a year in our eco-socialist Green New Deal for providing that green machinery for the industrial sector and green energy or clean energy production. Because that investment, I mean, you can say we owe a climate debt because of our historical emissions and our current emissions abroad. But I look at that as an investment in the habitability of the planet for us, as well as the people who've been most harmed by climate change so far. So that's what we need to fight for, a global eco-socialist Green New Deal. And we're getting pieces of it, little pieces of it. So I guess you could say we maybe turn the corner, but we're not there yet. So I don't want to run on too long. So thanks everybody for listening, and we'll be here next week. Next week I will be at a demonstration in Albany in conjunction with COP26, demanding a global Green New Deal and an emergency program to deal with the climate emergency. So I'm not sure where I'll be doing this from, but it'll be from Albany, New York, right after a climate demonstration. And there are demonstrations going on next Saturday all over the country. So I hope you'll look for those. If you go online and look up COP26 Coalition, I think, if you Google around, you'll find it, because there are demonstrations all over the country. I will be at the one at Albany, and see you next week right after that. So have a good week.